The dust sounded like thunder. For a long moment it was only the sound of hooves and heat, an endless, grinding summer that pushed the town of Redemption Springs low into its own mirage. Then came the shots. 3, quick and brutal, a staccato that ripped the quiet into ragged pieces. Jake Cordell had heard gunfire his whole life, but nothing made the world stop like the sight of a body on Main Street and the flash of a sheriff's star in the dirt. He rode in hard enough to throw a spray of grit from the saddlebow. His horse's flanks heaved, his hat was low, eyes shaded by sweat and sun. Jake Cordell had been more places than he could hold in his bones. Ranches from the Pecos to the Platte, a dozen towns where a man could make a living if he kept his head down and his gun hand steady. He'd thought he was done with towns that tugged at his past. He had prayed, if that's the word for a man like him, who more often swore than bowed, to never see one face again. He'd meant it with the hard, private kind of pleading men hand themselves when they leave behind what they broke. Now the wind stung his cheeks with grit, and a woman's cry cut through the air like a blade. Jake was out of the saddle before the horse had stopped rolling. He dropped, boots hitting a packed street, and in the space of a breath he was moving. 3 men threw themselves toward him. One lifted a rifle, another a knife flashing near his hip. The third came in with a crowbar. Jake's hand fell to the grip of his peacemaker, and the world narrowed to sight and weight and muscle. The first man went down with a single hard shot in the chest. The second never finished the motion with the knife. Jake's elbow met him in a crucible of fate. The third tried to bolt. Jake's aim was clean. They were men with desperate eyes. By the time Jake had finished, he found himself staring at the street and breathing hard, not from exertion so much as from the shape of what he'd seen. There was a man on the ground, wide shoulders, a sheriff's star flattened into his chest by dust and blood. A woman knelt beside him, one hand pressed to his side, the other lifting a blood-smeared face, lips trembling around words that didn't make sense to Jake at first. He stepped closer, and the dust that had stuck to his boots seemed to dry a little colder. Catherine Daniels stared back up at him. Jake had thought he'd left her in the embers of one summer night, had meant to extinguish every memory. She had been 17 that night, and a promise had been screamed in both of them, words that meant more than vows, more than any oath to a town or a ranch. He'd gone the way of men who keep moving. He had thought that would be enough. For 17 years the name Catherine had sat in a small, locked place behind his ribs like a stone. He had told himself he'd rather forget than face what he'd done. Now he saw the sheriff's star on her chest.
Now he saw the lines at the corners of her mouth, the gray that threaded her dark hair, where once she had worn it like a banner. She'd been a girl who could shoot better than most men. She'd fixed a saddle by candlelight and run the saloon ledger when the owner was too drunk to balance the books. That girl had grown into a woman who had a marshal's badge and a hard way of smiling. Jake dropped to his knees. He felt the hollow ache open in his chest, like a wound that had never quite closed. "Catherine," he said, and his voice sounded like a man who had swallowed something he could not spit out. She blinked, fingers trembling. Recognition came slow at first, as though her mind was piecing a map. Then her hand tightened on the sheriff who lay there, and she stared at Jake with a look he would never forget. Not anger exactly, not only grief, something like the weather in between, a cold that made a man's fingers numb. "You," she began, and the world shrank to the two of them and the scent of blood and horse. Conversation hung on the brink of an impossible gulf. For 17 years they'd walked separate circles, and in the space of a single afternoon, the past had slammed its fist through the present. Jake acted on instinct. He pulled the man, the sheriff, her husband, some stranger with a badge, into the shade of a doorway and pressed his palm to the wound at the man's side. He knew enough to know time was thinner than patience. "Get Dr. Jameson," he barked to no one particular. "Find the saloon boy, get a blanket." A stable boy, Tom Perkins, a gawky kid with more courage than experience, came running, breathless, followed by the doctor with his bag, his face already set in that look doctors wore when life was half hope and half ledger. The doctor crouched, fingers swift and methodical. "He's been hit low," he muttered, voice thin. "Feels like the gut, maybe nicked the liver. We need to stop the bleeding." Catherine's hands were steady in a way that startled Jake. She helped with bandages, pressing cloth into place, though the lines at her eyes showed she was younger and older all at once. For a moment she didn't look at him, then she did, and her gaze cut straight through whatever defenses he had left. "What are you doing here, Jake?" she asked, not cruel, only flat. He could have lied. Every instinct screamed to shelter under the excuses of the road, the reasons that men like him carry. Work on a spread 50 miles away, trouble elsewhere. But the truth was something you could not fit into a pocket. Rode through this morning, he said, heard shots, came to help. Her laugh was brief and bitter. Help. You always had a way of showing up where the noise was. The world was very loud for a moment, horses stamping, the murmur of gathered townsfolk, the doctor's muttered assessments. People had started to show themselves at the windows, at thresholds, faces awoken to violence and community in the same breath.
Redemption Springs wasn't a place that saw many strangers in a hurry, and all its folk were the kind who sewed lines between them like a net that could keep out the wind or the bullets. Jake could feel them. Hoskins, a broad man who ran the livery. Jenkins, thin-faced and farming-hardened. Perkins, the stable boy with dirt under his nails. They gathered close enough to press, but not so close as to break the work the doctor was doing. By the time they got the sheriff, by whatever right or wrong name he held, to the soft bed under Dr. Jameson's lamp, the town had an ache in its bones. Men muttered about who had done this. A whisper went on the wind that made tales of people's voices. The Garretts. Jake knew the name without being told. He had heard it once, years back at a poker table, when someone had mentioned a string of bad debts and worse tempers. The Garretts were the sort for whom a slight was a winter, for whom a death was a debt. There had been rumors that the Garrett brothers, Billy, Tom, Frank, and Bobby, didn't much like law that stood between them and what they wanted. A town like Redemption Springs had a way of keeping a ledger. The Garrett line held a page of its own. The story was this. Months earlier, under Catherine's order as sheriff, Bobby Garrett had been arrested for shooting up the west side of town in a temper. The trial had been short, more show than absolution, and Bobby had been found guilty by a jury that a sheriff commanded with the weight of her word. He'd been hanged on a morning so bitter the rope creaked like a chorus. The Garretts swore vengeance, and vengeance was their family business. Jake looked at Catherine then and saw, in the scarred set of her jaw, the cost of the badge she'd put on. "You," he started, then let it go. Time had taught him that explanations were a kind of currency. Most of the time they were worthless in the face of bullets. She met his eyes and nodded once. "It was the law," she said. "He shot a boy in front of the church. I did what I had to." "You did right," Jake heard himself say, and he could taste the iron of admission in his mouth. He hadn't expected to say it, but there was a steadiness to her that kept the town alive. Poor bastard got what he deserved. Catherine's face hardened, not because she took pleasure in the man's fate, but because justice in a place that could be savage was something she had chosen to shoulder. She had married once after, James Daniels, a gentle man who tended the town's ledger and kept the library in order, until fever took him 2 winters later. After that, the town had turned to her for order. She'd put on the star because someone had to stand between law and lawlessness. Jake thought of the night he left. He thought of her wedding earlier than he should, of the way he had watched her from the shadows, and decided that he could no longer be the man who would tie himself to any town.
He'd been a cowboy with the road in his bones. The road is a cruel kind of husband. He'd convinced himself moving on was nobility and self-preservation all wrapped together. Now he felt the opposite, cowardice more than anything, and the thought stuck to him like frost. If there was comfort to be had, it was raw and small. Dr. Jameson worked with the single-minded focus of a man who'd seen death's coy smile too often. He told them the sheriff had a chance if the blood loss could be staunched and fever kept at bay. "We'll need to keep him quiet," Jameson said. "A fever will set faster than you think. And if the Garretts get wind of this—" He did not finish, and the silence was answer enough. Word moved like kindling through Redemption Springs. By dusk, the town was awake and ready. People who had spent their days in quiet trade were hauling shutters, stacking barrels as makeshift barricades, and moving wagons to narrow the street. Jake found himself speaking like a man who had not intended to command people. He pointed where to set up 2 men with rifles, suggested the saloon as a fallback, and marked the alleyways he thought were likely approaches for a raid. The town listened because it had to. Survival is a better teacher than law. Thomas Blackwood came to stand by Jake's side, hands gripping the brim of his hat. Thomas had been Catherine's deputy for a long while, a man whose face had more lines than he deserved, and a loyalty that might have been born from fear as much as from devotion. "Charlie's not a man to leave this be," Thomas said, voice low. "He'll come with half his mane, quick as a rattler." Jake's jaw tightened. Charlie Garrett had a reputation that reached past the river and the next ridge. He was a broad-shouldered man with a cruel mouth and the glint of a man who thought the law was another thing to beat into submission. He'd lost a brother, Bobby, and losses like that change a man's math. They made vengeance a calculation. "We'll need to know numbers," Jake said. "How many do you reckon?" He found himself thinking in maps and angles, as if the old life of roaming had left him with nothing but an instinct for placement and timing. "Hard to say," Thomas admitted. "Maybe 20 if he pulls from the south table. Could be more if he calls every favor he ever bought." "The south ridge, then," Jake said. He could see it. Men spread out by barrels, a hidden signal, the 3-shot mark they'd used to warn of a breach. The 3-shot sound, bang, 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 had become a shorthand for the town's peril. It was a small tradition borrowed from military tales and ranch memory, something that could snap a man out of sleep into the hard grin of combat. They worked for hours, fastening planks over windows, hiding rifles behind stacks of feed, lining men along roofs where they could bring down a sightline to the street.
Hoskins tied a bit of scrap to his bootlace and cursed when it snapped. Perkins tended to the wounded sheriff's bed without complaint. Dr. Jameson improvised splints and bandages with the slow dignity of a surgeon with no theater. Jenkins, who had lost a son to the canyon last year, stood like a pillar and said little, his silence a measurement of resolve. At one point, in the lull between tasks, Jake found Catherine standing away from the bustle, her hands wiping at a smear on her sleeve, as if it were the only thing she could do to keep control. He moved toward her slowly, not wanting to startle her. She felt like a thing half-remembered and entirely present. "I thought," he started, and the words stopped like a horse on a rein. What did a man say to the woman he'd wanted to take with him and had instead left with a life that kept its own counsel? "I thought you'd never come back," she said without turning. "Not into town, not here. Some men leave and you never see them again. They become stories to fill the cellar." "They are the easiest kind to forget," Jake said. "But I never could forget you, Cat." The use of the old nickname came out before he thought. It tasted like apology. She turned then, eyes wet and hard in the way of someone who'd been punched by grief and was trying to keep upright. "You left," she said simply. "You left us to the law and the weather. You left me with the ledger and the badge and the funeral pyres. We all wore our reasons like winter coats. Yours fit better than mine, I guess." He wanted to tell her why he'd left, to tell her about the gambling man with the lion's grin who'd offered him a cut of a run and a way out from under a promise he never wanted to keep, to tell her about the tax of staying, the kinds of compromises men make until their names are as smeared as a saloon bill. But none of that eased what mattered, which was that he'd been gone and she'd stayed, and the life had been forced into shapes neither had expected. "You did right," he heard himself say again. It sounded like a prayer and a condemnation at once. "You held up the law." She laughed, a short, bitter sound. "Law is fine when you can count on folks to respect it. Where I come from," she gestured broadly with a hand, the gesture taking in the town, the ridge, the sky. "It's a thing wrapped in a badge and not in men's oaths. People turn their faces, people look the other way. I didn't want to be that kind of sheriff." "You forced men to look," Jake said. "That's dangerous." "It's necessary," Catherine replied. She added quieter, "We don't get to choose whether danger comes, Jake, only how we meet it." They were interrupted by a shout. Hoskins had climbed to the roof of the general store and was waving his hat, eyes wide. Far off on the south ridge, a cloud of dust was forming like the throat of some large beast. Someone had brought a spyglass to bear, and the circles of distance held more and more men until they looked like beetles on the horizon. The Garretts were moving, and with them came the shape of consequences. Jake's heart thudded in his chest with a drum steady and old. His hands found the butt of his gun as if by habit, and the town drew breath as one organism. Men and women who had lived their days with the slow mathematics of chores were now in the ledger of a different account. They made lists of themselves. Who would stand the barricade? Who would tend to the wounded? Who would try to keep children from the windows? It felt like preparing a ship for a storm. That night, under a sky free of moon and stitched with hard stars, Jake and Catherine laid out a plan that had the blunt efficiency of those who know the land by the shape of their eyes. They put men on the roofs to control sightlines. They hid a rope and a trip line behind the church for anyone who came fast and reckless. They placed Dr. Jameson in the boarding house with a lamp that could be seen through slats, in case anyone needed healing in the dark. They marked the alley behind the saloon as a fallback and stacked barrels there to funnel any man who came at them into a narrow throat. And for the signal, a sound both simple and terrible, they agreed on 3 shots. Bang, bang, bang.
It would be the town's cry and its warning. Jake practiced firing into a barrel until his wrist ached. The sound would mean pull together. The sound would mean kill or be killed. It would mean the people of Redemption Springs had decided to carve their claim into the night. Under the lamplight, Catherine walked the street with a torch and checked the men's hands. She looked at Jake sometimes, and in those small looks there were 1,000 stories. Once she paused and put her palm against the sheriff's star on her chest, as if to anchor herself in the weight of the metal. "You ever tell anyone why you left?" she asked Jake at one point, voice low enough that the men nearby didn't hear. "Once," he said, "to a barmaid." She laughed, said a man who runs from his heart will always hear it calling. I didn't like the laugh. Catherine let the silence hold them both. "You should have stayed," she said finally. "We could have..." The rest of the sentence died on the wind, swallowed by a sound like carriage wheels on a distant road. "I thought I'd be better for leaving," Jake said. "I thought I was sparing you the things I was bound to bring." "You brought yourself," she said, "and it was not meant as a curse exactly. I learned to carry what needed carrying. You walked away." The truth between them was a thing heavy enough to sink a man. Jake turned his face away, feeling the old shame rise like a tide. He thought of the men he'd killed, not in the street that afternoon, but before, at a river crossing. 2 names he'd held in his mouth like nails.
He thought about whether leaving had been an act of mercy or cowardice. He thought that sometimes a man's ideas of mercy are just a shape of cowardice in better clothes. The town's council of defense, if such a thing could be called council, met in the dim of the livery, over crates and horse's breath. They spoke in low voices about Charlie Garrett. Hoskins had seen him once at a poker table and said he had the kind of eyes that set a man on a list. Jenkins knew a man who had served under Charlie in a cattle dispute. They all agreed the Garretts would not come alone. They would split their force, try to take the town by both charm and terror. They'd come in from the ridge for the main push and send a small, fast group through the east cut to the stable. If the stable fell, they could rout the horses, and the town would be without escape. Jake mapped this out with a charcoaled finger on the floor-swept board. "If they split," he said, "we keep the street. We let them think they've got the upper road and trap them when they move into town. Thomas, you and Perkins take the east. Jenkins, you and Hoskins hold the main roofline. We don't follow them one by one. We pull the trap." "Trap," Thomas said, tasting the word like he had never before. The plan had the raw geometry of a man who'd spent his life not just moving, but counting angles. Jake knew how to read an approach, wind direction, how dust would throw itself in a rider's face, which creek would muddle who falls, and which ridge would carry a shout. He didn't pretend this was a perfect thing. It was a tangle of hope and experience, and the kind of trick they could pull off if luck was on their side. As night settled, Jake walked the length of Main Street once more, boots scuffing the worn boards. He stopped before the saloon, where the lanterns threw amber light, and the muffled music from someone's piano kept time to a hand of cards being played somewhere inside. He felt the fingers of memory close around him, the feel of Catherine's hair once braided, the warmth of a hearth, a glass of something sweet gone wrong on a forgotten afternoon. He had prayed never to see her again, in the way a man prays when he doesn't want his heart to be a target again. The sight of her sheriff's star at her throat made him realize how little control a man had over the directions of his life. The town tightened in around the plan. Children were sent to a neighbor's cellar. Men checked their weapons and rechecked them. A candle guttered and went out somewhere in a home where a mother sat awake counting the breaths of a sleeping child. Jake sat a moment on a crate, looking down at his hands. They were calloused and steady, and likely to shake when a hard thing came close. He thought about Charlie Garrett, the man who would come with a rope and a grievance and a long memory for wrong. He thought of the sheriff lying beneath Jameson's lamp, and Catherine's hands moving with feverish care. He thought of what it meant to be the sort of man who could not run from a face. Storms have a way of clarifying a town. They collapse illusions and make visible what must be tended. This night felt like a storm. The first hint came as a sound, low and deliberate, like the rustle of a sleeping beast. It was a horse's snort, a cough of a man's breath in the dark. Then, distant and cleverly muffled, a single shot, a small pop meant to draw eyes. They had told the children to sleep, but sleep was a luxury the night would not grant. Jake rose and moved like a man with parts of himself wired to instinct. He took his place behind the store as the 3-shot signal hovered on his lips like a promise. Across the way, Catherine took her own station, the sheriff's star visible under her dimmed cloak. Men tucked themselves into shadows where they could be both unseen and deadly. There was a whisper near the alley, feet on gravel. Then another. The rainfall of hooves had not yet begun. This was the prelude to it. A whisper of breath. A shadow against the moonlit ridge. Jake tightened his fingers around the cold steel of his revolver. He felt the world poised on a small, thin hinge, one decision away from cracking open. He thought again of the things he'd lost, and the faces he'd promised never to meet. He had prayed, in a way, for the silence of absence. He had believed absence would save him. But some faces haunt a man until he answers them. The night waited, and Redemption Springs held its breath. If you love tales from the Old West, subscribe for more. The first move belonged to men who knew how to make noise and then vanish into it. A small party slipped like coyotes through the scrub on the east cut, eyes starlit and faces wrapped. Another column rode the ridge with saddles so quiet the horses might as well have been ghosts. The plan the town had sketched on the floor with a charred finger and a handful of hope was fragile as a spider's web. All it needed was the wrong touch. It came as 3 muffled pops meant to draw, mere decoys. Then suddenly, as the moon slid behind cloud, the night turned to thunder. A flare of torchlight licked the saloon's eaves. Men in garret colors burst from behind trees and rocks, shouting like they owned the dark. The split force had come true. A fast, small group rushed toward the stable, and the main column tipped down the ridge toward Main Street. Jake's gut tightened in that precise way years of living on the line had taught him. This was the moment small errors became graves. He fired his own warning, a dry, deliberate report into the air that answered the first 3-shot signal they had practiced like a prayer. It was the town's clarion. From the roofs and behind shuttered windows, figures leapt into their posts, breath coming hard and hot. From the livery roof, Hoskins's rifle cracked, then another, then a chorus.
The street became a weaving of light and shadow, and the dull glances of men whose lives had never been meant to include a number of dead. Jake heard the impact of a bullet in a wooden post, the dull thud of it, as close as a hand. Splinters flew like brittle rain. Somebody down below cursed as something hot struck a board and spat dust. Then Thomas's voice cut clear. "Hold, don't let them into the center." They had planned for this kind of crash. They had not counted on the sound of children's feet in the boarding house, the holler of a woman who'd lost her nerve at the window. Panic is a small, practical thing that ruins the best-laid lines. Jake's shout to a man on the saloon roof, "Keep that left clear," felt like throwing himself into the map and being part of the fingers that drew the lines. On the east side, the garrets moved quick and low. The stable door had been bolted, but a small group of their men, slim, quick, had smuggled a ladder and were forcing it aside from the alley. Perkins, the stable boy, had taken his place at the far end behind a stack of feed, jaw clenched. He was 18, but the night treated him older. He had the look of someone who would never be a tavern story. A figure slammed into the alley and a scuffle began, hands on rope, a man's teeth gritting as he tried to pull a board free. Jake saw the movement, and with a shout that tasted of metal, he flung himself down from his perch and charged, heart and young again. He met one of the intruders at the threshold, and they traded blows without ceremony. The man's knife flashed. Jake caught the wrist and twisted as if he were still wrestling horses, and the knife clattered aside. A muffled shot rang. Perkins, crouched behind a bale with his rifle, made a sudden, stupid sound and fell. He did not get up. For a moment, the world teetered. Jake felt the air leave his chest. Perkins' eyes were wide, not with pain so much as surprise at being paid so soon in the ledger of life. Jake dropped to his knees beside him, hands pressed to where the boy had been hit, but the warmth was fading fast. Perkins' mouth moved, a single syllable. "Sure." And then, as if something unseen had taken his last breath, he went slack. "No," Jake said aloud, though the word meant little. Around them there was the heavy business of combat, the crack of rifles, Thomas's low oath, the roar from the ridge, the desperate shout of men trying to drag wounded into places lit only by lamps. The stable had been turned into a small field hospital by necessity.
Dr. Jameson's lamplight picked out faces and the sheen of sweat. The doctor's hands were steady as ever, but his eyes were narrower now, edged in a kind of bitter knowledge. Perkins' body was moved aside like refuse, and Jake felt the weight of it as if it were his own. He had not known the boy long, but for men who travel the same roads, a few kind acts make you kin. Thomas clapped a hand heavy on Jake's back as if to hold him upright.
"We can't stop for every fall," he said, the words meant to be practical, but tasting like a rueful prayer. "We hold the line." They did hold, but the holding came at a cost. Jenkins of the Northfield, Jenkins with hands the size of spades and a silence that said more than any speech, took a round on the roof. He had been the kind of man who stood in lines and fixed fences, who taught his children how to listen to the weather. When he went, there was no scream, only the slow fall of his body away from the light. Someone in the crowd had a choke of a noise that would later be called a cry. The Garretts fought like men who had decided life owed them repayment. Every volley came with a swear and a face. They used smoke to hide runs, set small fires to drive animals mad, tried to break the ropes that would hand them the street. It was cunning, but not enough. Jake watched as men he barely knew became the instruments of the plan, men who had once been gentle with horses, now steadying a sight with the intensity of a priest. They picked their moments, pulled the trap, and when the main force thought the town staggered, the trap slammed. The center of Main Street became a churn of boot leather and splintered wood. Jake ducked as a rifle cracked near his ear, and the smell of powder clung to his hair. He saw Charlie Garrett then, in a pool of torchlight, broad, barking, with a mouthful of teeth that had known too many hard things. Charlie rode without a shirt under his coat for the look of it, like a man who wanted his scars to be seen. He had the lean smell of someone who slept little and feared nothing. At his side were men with faces like questions and hands trained to destroy. There was a moment, absurd and terrible, when Jake met Charlie's eyes across the chaos. For a second, the weapons dropped away, and two histories crashed into one frame. A man who'd lost brothers and burned winter, and a man who'd left his own warm rooms to come back and take responsibility. Charlie sneered, and for a breath Jake saw not only the man's rage, but the private ledger. Bobby Garrett hung, a rope that sang like crows. Charlie looked like a man who wanted someone's life to fit the harsh arithmetic of his grief. "Where's your badge, Sheriff?" Charlie bawled, loud enough to reach the rooftops. He pointed with his chin at Catherine, who was moving like a machine, stomping a hand to a man who'd been about to pass out. She had taken a graze on her forearm, blood dark against cloth, but her jaw did not waver. For the town, she was stone and metal together. Jake felt an old itch rise, a temptation that had sat with him in bars and at lonely campfires. Do the right thing by killing the right man. In that raw hour, that temptation looked like justice. Charlie's mouth said things meant to provoke. He rode up to the edge of the barricade, took aim with a slow theatricality, and shot a man who'd been trying to bring a child down from a window.
The child's arms flailed, and someone caught the little body, face pale. "He's mine," Charlie snarled. "You took my kin. You took what was ours." "Ain't no man's life worth your law," Jake wanted to say, felt the sentence like a blade in his mouth. The world had narrowed to breath and the shudder of gunfire and the heat of someone's pain under his palms. Then, as if on cue, Charlie spurred his horse and leapt from it with a wild grin, landing too close to the barricade. He tied his words to a rope and flung them like bait. "Go on then, Cordell. You wanted to be the man that couldn't be tied down. Kill me, if you're so righteous." It was a provocation designed to undo a life. The crowd pressed, eyes hungry. Men I knew only in passing clenched their fists around revolvers, breathing as though at the edge of drowning. If Jake had fired, a dozen things might have happened. A cheer, a night without more blood, the simple satisfaction of ending a face that had haunted his sleep. But to kill Charlie where he stood would have been to slip the town back into the trough of vengeance. Law would become rumor. The Garrett's rage would be the town's law, and Redemption Springs would wake every morning with the stench of yesterday's lynching. Jake saw Catherine then, the sheriff, standing with a piece of her sleeve tied to a man's wound, the badge at her throat heavy with the weight she'd chosen. Her eyes were on him, and in them he saw not the pleading of a lover, but the steadiness of a public duty. She moved like someone who had endured losses and counted each one, and she was looking at him not as a man who had left, but as the one who might anchor the town to a better choice. He found his jaw unclenching by a small measure, and felt the slow, painful honesty of what he had always known.
He could be the man who enforced a different rule, one that did not answer with a rope at the end of a night. Killing Charlie would be a kind of shortcut, a blot that would grant immediate satisfaction, but leave the town poorer in law and richer in grudges. He had lived under too many grudges. Jake lowered his gun. The gesture did not stop the world. The battle continued in a spasm of desperate movements. Men taking cover, the doctor calling for more bandages, someone setting down a lantern so it would not hand a target. But in that moment of lowering the weapon, he did something else he had not sure he could do. He ordered movement. "Tie him," he barked, voice hard enough to cut through the din. "Bring him down alive." A young man, Bobby Love, who ran the bakery and had never before raised a weapon, heard and moved like a man of fate. He darted, slipped past a downed rider, and shoved a length of leather into Charlie's arm when the man's attention was diverted. Thomas and a pair of men tackled the big man to the ground with the clumsy force of those who had to learn to handle weight. Charlie fought, a cornered thing, his face purple with rage, his teeth bared.
But the town had numbers, and numbers are sometimes enough against pure fury. In the scuffle, Jake's hand slipped and his palm opened to feel the slick of blood on his fingers. He had a shallow graze from a splinter, but it ached like an old hurt. He thought, absurdly, some small, private prayer he'd fashioned years ago about never seeing her face again. How odd that life could force a man to answer a face he'd hoped to escape. The irony was sharp enough to sting. Yet the world had offered him choice, and choice smelled faintly of redemption. They bound Charlie with rope, crude but efficient, and hauled him to the saloon where the sheriff's office had been improvised into a cage. Around him he cursed and spat words that would be stacked against him later. Catherine stood over him, the sheriff's star catching a stray flare of light. She said nothing at first, letting the quiet do the work. "You'll hang him," Charlie sneered at one point, the old thirst for blood making his voice thin with long memory. "Not here," Catherine said, voice low and explicit. "Not by our hands." Jake, leaning on the bar with a cloth pressed to his forearm, watched the man he had a second earlier been tempted to kill. He felt an odd emptiness and a bitter relief. The choice had not been a clean salvation. It was only a step towards something more complicated. The Garretts were not blind to the consequences. Some of their men were hauled off to the courthouse in chains. Others were left dead in the street. The battle had taken those whose names the town would remember at funerals. At dawn, the street smelled of smoke and wet leather. The town counted its dead and tended its wounded. The sight of Perkins laid out in the general store's back room weighed on every man who'd seen him fall. Jenkins's funeral was that afternoon, simple and lined with dirt. Men who had fought side by side now stood with spades and shovels, as if the earth could hold more than the cost of the night. Charlie Garrett was held in the saloon, where, under the lamp, he swung his legs like a caged man and cursed the sky. People came to stare and to hurl questions. Jake caught some of their looks, some gratitude, some resentment, that this man had not been shot through the head and buried where he lay. For many, it was hard to reconcile the rough justice they craved with the gentler law Catherine insisted upon. She walked among them with a badge and a manner that did not beg popularity. At midday, a circuit rider from the nearest county came with a writ and men to escort Charlie to a proper jail. There would be a trial in a town with a bench, a judge, and the slow, cold work of evidence. Jake watched the man go, riding with his hands bound, his mouth a blur of bitter vows. Catherine supervised the handing off in a tight, economical way. The county men nodded at her, a small acknowledgement of work done. For Jake, the sight of Charlie being led away was a relief, with a taste of cedar, pleasant but somehow sharp. There was grief to be tended and bones to be bound. Dr. Jameson labored through nights and days, setting broken collarbones, tying neat stitches in a dozen small wounds. His hands smelled faintly of carbolic and powder, and his eyes were rimmed in the way of men who have seen too many ways a body can fail. He patched more than flesh, his counsel stitched nerves frayed by fear. There were funerals, too, measured in pipes and in the quiet moaning of some men who would never sleep the same. Jake and Catherine sat on the steps by the church when the last grave had been filled. The town had a way of closing ranks that felt like both comfort and a confession. The two of them had been in the center of a storm that would, like many storms, leave the land changed. "You did good," Jake said finally, the words carrying the dust of the last night. He was tired in a way that bones remember, the kind of fatigue that leaves you both hollow and oddly full. He had lost a boy he'd only just known. He had saved a town that he'd wandered back into. He had chosen to obey law rather than the immediate hunger of vengeance. Catherine folded her hands on her lap, the sheriff's star glinting. Her arm bore a bandage where a bullet had grazed her. "We did what we had to," she said. "Not because we like pain, but because a town can't feed itself on revenge forever." He would have turned the line into something softer. "Every damned day," he would have said perhaps, if the exact line of the DNA were to be preserved in spirit. Instead, he let a simpler truth come out. "I thought I'd be free by walking off," he said. "Turns out you can't run from the shapes you make of other folks." She looked at him then, the look that had always said far more than any speech, and the thin line between them shifted a fraction. There was no swift forgiveness, no wipe of the ledger. There was only the honest, hard work of two people who had been remade by events, and who had to decide what to do with the pieces. "You could stay," she said. "Not a plea so much as a fact offered for consideration. We could use a man who knows how to read a movement of horses." Jake felt the old impulse, flight, tremble in him. It had been his companion long enough to make a habit of being the kind of choice he turned to on any map. But the night had done things to him. The faces of Perkins and Jenkins haunted his throat. The sight of Charlie being led away without blood on his hands felt strangely right. Law had been chosen, and now it could do its work if men let it. "Stay." He attempted the word and found it something heavy and new in his mouth. He thought of the long arcs of a life on the road and of the kind of building that was more than a shelter for a night. "I want to build something that lasts," he said, the sentence carrying all the weight of a vow that would be tested over years.
Catherine watched him as if measuring the moment, and then, in a smallness that felt enormous, she reached out and put her hand on his. The touch was brief, a beginning. "We'll see," she said. "But if you stay, you don't get to run when it's hard. That's the bargain." "I know," he said. The word was simple and true. In the weeks that followed, Redemption Springs readjusted itself to the absence of certain men and to the difficult return of others. The bakery smelled of warm bread again. Children resumed a cautious play in the yard. Horses were reshod and wagons mended. The town had been changed by violence, but also by the memory that when it had been forced to choose, it had not given itself entirely to the dark. The county court was a slow thing. Charlie Garrett's trial took place in a town that was a day's ride away. There were witnesses who came forward, some with faces full of the fear that tightens truth, and some who could barely look a man in the eye because they had seen too much. Evidence was presented, testimonies given in voices that carried their part of the night like a burden. The judge, an old man in a black robe that smelled of oil and paper, listened with the patient detachment of one who has seen the same use of men's worst and best. Charlie protested his treatment, but the law, this time, held him in the right. He was found guilty of murder and conspiracy, and sentenced not to the immediate satisfaction of a rope in the street, but to a term that would remove him from the town's ready reach. There was grumbling in the courts and in the taverns. Some would say later that the consequence did not fit the grief of lives lost. But law is a slow and blunt instrument. It bends by process. Redemption Springs watched as their choice, the refusal to return to lynch law, carved out a different path for the town. At night, after the funerals and the trial and the tallying, Jake found himself at the livery more often, mending a saddle here, helping Hoskins count feet there. He boxed the shape of small tasks and worked at them like a man learning to rebuild a house, one nail at a time, one plank against the wind. They and Catherine spoke in fragments at first, then in longer sentences. They spoke about ordinary things, the well, the odd plumbing of a neighbor, the list of names needing horses shod. And somewhere in those conversations, their histories were repurposed into a present that might hold them both. There were nights Jake woke to the memory of the boy's last breath and the smell of gun smoke, and there were days when he would find Catherine in the morning, her hair braided tight, her face resting like a map of small wars. Once, under a sky gone thin and blue, she took him to the place where the town kept a small plot of land for the graves of the fallen. Perkins's marker was crude and hand-carved, the letters uneven. Jenkins's stone was small, the soil near it padded by hands that ached to do more.
"I thought," Catherine said quietly, as they stood there, "sometimes I thought the law would mean I could stand back from pain. I was wrong. The law makes you see pain. It doesn't make you immune to it. It only gives you a reason to try something else." Jake touched the wood of Perkins's marker, the grooves rough under his thumb. "I pried myself away from that," he said. "I thought that quitting was mercy. Turns out leaving is just another way of collecting the bills later." Catherine watched him with the same steadiness he'd grown to know like a rope. "We all pay," she said. "Some pay in the field, some in little rooms with a lamp. the town keeps score in ways we can't always count. Months slid by with the slow certainty of seasons. The harvest came in, and men who had fought in the street now sat down at tables and split bread in ways that seemed designed to seal small wounds. Jake took to waking early to mend a fence or fix the hitch of a cart. He learned the names of children he had never bothered to learn before. A small, precise education in the business of staying. 3 months after the night they had held their line, the town had its first true quiet dawn in a long while. The sun rose like a promise, the kind that is both tender and brutal. It lights things evenly, showing every flaw. Jake walked to the ridge with Catherine at his side, the two of them almost silent, a companionable quiet that meant something like reconciliation. They watched the sun creep up over the mesas and paint the roofs of Redemption Springs in a gold that made even the broken look dignified. The town stretched below them, wagons, the stable, the saloon with a new board nailed over the window where the bullet had gone through. Children chased one another in a yard, and a man watered a plant that had been forgotten during the long frost. Jake felt the weight of all the night's press and also the quiet potential of mornings. "I want to build something that lasts," he had said months earlier, and the words now had a shape. He wanted not only a house, but a thing that would be larger than a single man's needs, a community he could be counted on in. He wanted to do this small and dull work of repair in a way that meant staying. Catherine shifted beside him, the sheriff's star catching sunlight. Her hand found his and held it in a way that was both intimate and public. "We'll have to be patient with each other," she said, voice soft. "There will be nights when you'll want to go. There will be days when I walk a line you can't imagine. But this," she nodded to the town below, "this is ours to guard." Jake tasted the salt of a smile. "I'm used to long roads," he confessed, "but I'm not sure they ever led to anything I needed." She leaned into him, a small, deliberate weight. "Maybe they were just ways of testing whether we'd choose to come back," she said. He thought of the prayer he'd made in a different life, the harsh hope that he might never see her face again.
It seemed then a childish thing, born of fear and cowardice, not the hard, honest kind of asking that would make a man better. He had not been saved by a lightning bolt or a miracle. He had been changed by a chain of choices that started with one low decision, lowering his gun, and rippled outward. Jake looked at her, at the lines that life had drawn, and at the eyes that had the work of 100 small judgments. He saw not only the woman he loved, but the leader who had carried the town when it might have broken into anarchy. He saw steadiness and a courage that was not theatrical. He saw a future neither of them could yet name. "Well then," he said, and his voice had the small clatter of a man beginning to build. "Let's go home. We can work on the roof first thing." Catherine's mouth did something like a smile, and then they turned together down the ridge. The town received them as two who had walked through a fire and come back stubborn to life. People called names and waved tools. A child ran up to Jake and handed him a small, crooked stick, as if it were a sword. Jake took it with the kind of solemnity that pleased the child. The saloon door swung, and someone inside started a strange, thin tune on the piano. It sounded like a town trying to laugh again. The sun came full over the street and burned away most of the cold. In the weeks that followed, small things happened like seeds breaking soil. Jake took a stable and made it his workshop, a place where hands were needed and where he could keep watch. He fixed a broken fence near Catherine's house, and then another. And when she would pass, he might stand on the porch and hand her a cup of coffee. People saw him and saw a man who had decided not to run. They accepted him as if they had been waiting for the choice. Every now and then, when the night was quiet and the town seemed to be holding its breath in the hush before sleep, Jake would remember the moments of that awful evening, the flashes, the small bright lives gone off like struck matches, the raised gun, and the face, Catherine's face, he had once begged himself to never see again. He thought of the prayer in that strange, private way a man might speak to his own dark parts, not a supplication to God, but a demand of himself to live differently. Catherine bore the memory too, but she bore it like a woman who had put things through a sieve and chosen what to keep. Her star had a scratch in it from the night. She wore it nonetheless, a symbol that law can be worn and still be honest. Their relationship did not snap into some simple script. There were nights when old words caused awkwardness, when he would say something that made her remember grief. And there were afternoons when she would catch him staring at a picture he had found in the saloon, a faded photograph of two people on a ranch, then tuck it back into his pocket and fold his face into the work. Love here was neither clean nor theatrical.
It was the small collection of acts: coffee handed at dawn, a hand placed on a shoulder in the rain, a quiet watch while a town slept. Months later, they would stand again at a small celebration when the harvest was in and the town's wounds looked less raw. People danced on the porch of the general store. There was laughter the way there is after a long illness in a household. It was tentative and sweet. Jake and Catherine stood near the edge and watched. She glanced at him and then leaned in, their shoulders touching like two things that understood the same hurt. When the music died down and the lamps were brought out, Jake took a step toward her, then another, then closed a space between them. He placed his hand on the small of her back and drew her close. They kissed then, not with the hunger of the past, but with the steadiness of two people who had decided to be present to a world that often asked too much. The town slept that night under a sky that was honest and wide. In the quiet of his bed, Jake thought about the face he had prayed never to see. It did not feel like an enemy now. It had become a ghost turned companion, an old reckoning that had offered him a chance to meet himself as he was, and to choose again. He slept with the thought that some remakes are not epic, they are the slow cementing of daily things. Weeks turned into months. Charlie Garrett served his sentence far enough away to give the town the room to breathe. Dr. Jameson set up a small infirmary and caught up on sleep like a man who had found a little grace. Hoskins and the others reaped their small, quiet victories in markets and fences. Perkins and Jenkins were mourned with an intensity that left behind a hollow, but the town stitched itself. The law had held, and in doing so had given a different sort of victory. On a morning 3 months from the night that had bent their lives, Jake and Catherine walked the length of Main State together. Men tipped hats, women smiled. There were new boards on the saloon, fresh paint on the livery sign. It was not a town untouched. It was a town that had been forced to answer a brutal question and had chosen to answer in a way that did not drown in blood. They paused at the edge of the town, where the dirt road stretched out like an invitation. Jake looked over the ledge at the road that had always called his name. He felt the old itch for open country, for nights without responsibility. But the feeling was different now. It had edges of something that might be a life. "I prayed never to see that face again once," he said, a small confession that felt like clearing a throat. "Funny how you think you can run from what you are." Catherine turned to him, the sheriff's star quietly bright. "We all pray," she replied. "Some prayers are for forgetting. Some are for learning to answer faster." Jake took her hand and squeezed. "Let's see what we can build," he said. "Together?" she asked, not demanding, but hopeful.
Together, he agreed. They walked back into town, shoulders brushing as if in rehearsal, the street welcoming them. There would be more nights, and there would be more fights. The world is stubborn that way. But there would also be bread at the table, and a man who had learned to stay. Redemption Springs would endure and remember, and the choices they had made one hot July night would shape the town's story for years to come. If this story moved you, like and subscribe, and tell us below, would you risk everything for a second chance?